PseudoPod is extruded into this universe from a dimension of purest fear. It's beautiful in its own alien way, but what's to come will unsettle you. PseudoPod, episode 691, February 28th, 2020. This week's story, Half Men of the Night Marie, by Robin Hewson. Hey everybody, welcome to PseudoPod, the weekly horror podcast. I'm Alistair, your host, and this week's story first appeared in Phobos magazine, issue 4, published back in 2017. Your reader for this piece is Halloween Bloodfrost. Halloween is currently an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania and hopes to establish a screenwriting program for LGBTQIA youth specifically and minorities as a whole in order to address the deficit of positive media representation. Je can be followed on Twitter. Your author, Robin, lives in Nottingham in the UK, where I used to live, and is a PhD student researching how humans and animals interact. She fits her studies in around her job at an animal shelter and writes stories in her spare time to relax. So, Robin and Halloween have a story for you. And having checked it over, I promise you, it's true.
Half Men of the Night Marie by Robin Hewson. Narrated by Halloween Bloodfrost. 3 half-men and a lifeboat drifted on the methane sea. Her ship's name, Night Marie, was written on the stern like a tombstone. The ship, along with the rest of her crew, had sunk 30 hours before sunset. Sparks, the ship's half-boy, crouched in the bows, his ears still ringing with the sound of screams, though the sea had long since swallowed them up. Hob, the mate, lit the lanterns. Beyond their circle of light, the darkness was total, as though they sat inside a bubble and a well of ink. "Well," Hob said at length, "we shouldn't have thrown old Creeping Jack overboard, that's what I say." Copper, the harpooner, stared unmoving at the sea. The only sound was the autofocus in his eyes, whirring every time the waves moved. "Old Jack was dead," Sparks piped up. He only spoke because Copper said nothing, and listening to Hob talk to himself might drive him to madness. "Aye, he was," Hob said, "but he was still worth a bit for parts. We might think we're nothing, just 3 bodies starving on a boat, but there's something to us all." In his hand he held 3 splinters from a fractured oar. He rolled them between his fingers like cigarettes. "Take you," he said to Sparks. "You know that body ain't even yours. The company made it." "The soft parts are mine," Sparks protested. "Oi, but what do they do?" "They're me." "Aye, and what good is that? What's you against the grand scheme of things?" Sparks had no answer. He hiccuped sadly, belching out ethane from his altered lungs. It was true that the company had taken him apart on the long sleep out and rebuilt him to survive on this backwards moon where the methane flowed and the water froze harder than rock. But he still felt the same in his vital self that lived behind his eyes. "It's just something to think about is all," Hob said. "The company will find us before it comes to that." Copper's huge throwing arm shot out from his silhouette and caught Hob by the throat. "Stop your thinking." His voice was like the sound of grinding gears. "You'd never spare a morsel for another man, not even your own mother." "Well, she ain't here." Hob struggled without effect. "And wrong besides. I do me part. But a ship needs a mate. Or what is she?" "She's 60 fathoms deep and insured with a hold full of oil. The company'll get their money, but no need to come back for us." Hobbs' breath narrowed to a wheeze. He grinned behind the gate of his respirator. "Now, copper, you'll scare the boy." "What does it matter? We're just spare parts. If I can tickle that kraken before I go, I'll die a happy man." "And keep that harpoon sharp," Hobbs said. Copper let him go with a grunt and went back to scanning the waves. Sparks had never seen the kraken which had sunk the Night Marie, just heard the hammer blow against the hull before the deck raised and buckled like a mountain range. But Copper had seen it, and had seen nothing else since, until his eyes were full of shadows which writhed. The moon's night wore on, overtaking their sleeps. Hob turned off the lights to save power. Sparks felt huge in the dark. His senses stretched to fill up the vastness of space. The sea was his guts sloshing. Each star was a puncture in his skin suit. He heard the sea churn. "She blows!" he cried, and the boat woke in a scramble. Hob cast his light across the surface to see it rock itself back to stillness, with no sign of a rising beast. "Lost it," he said. "Damn it, 7 black eyes!" His parts were starting to whir. Even Copper's eyes had dimmed, though he still scanned the waves with their dying light. "Who's going to eat who first?" he taunted Hob. "My money's on the kraken. Maybe I'll choke it going down." He gave a wet cough. His jaw seemed to freeze, and he jerked like a clockwork toy. "That's that, then," Hob said, but Copper still had his harpoon. Hob fretted and drummed his booted heel on the planks of the boat. The little boat rocked with a movement, and waves slapped against her side in an anxious rhythm. Sparks felt like the heater in his chest might explode. He hoped that it would, and that the blast would knock Hob right out of his seat and pitch him down to fret at the bottom of the sea. "We do his fair," Hob said at last. "Whoever draws the shortest, hear that, Copper? Fair's fair's." "I'll choke you going down," Copper spat through his clenched jaw. Hob grinned. 3 splinters of wood turned between his fingers, then vanished in his hand. Only the ends peeked out of his closed fist. "You first," he said to Copper. Sparks saw his fingers twitch as Copper drew. Hob caught him watching and winked. "Fair's fair," he said again, and let Sparks draw. Hob opened his hand to reveal the splinter he had kept. It was as long as his palm. Copper creaked his fingers open. His splinter was as long as Hob's. "Oh," Sparks said. The moon was cold. He'd never felt it before with his warmed-over blood, but now the cold came creeping in his skin suit. "Hob cheated," he said. "I saw his fingers twitch." "I saw that too," Copper said. "You let me draw all the same." "I was going to say something, I was." "After you picked my bones clean?" "No," Sparks said to the darkness. He'd been slow, that was all, slow from hunger and the long night. His thoughts were like pushing a rock upstream. "Now, lad," Hob said, "don't make this hard on us all." Hob showed Sparks the edge of his knife. The first cut sliced through his skin suit. He tried to cry out, but the heater in his chest picked up a notch and his ears rang with the sound of racing blood. Hob peeled off a strip of flesh and held it aloft, already stiffened and spiked with frost. He ate like a bird, a devil's heron, throwing his head back and downing the meat in a series of gulps. The macerator in his throat whirred. "That's good," he said, and sliced again. The next strip he handed to Copper, who growled with distaste, but did not refuse. He still had his teeth, and he ate like a wolf. The third strip Hob handed to Sparks. "We won't leave you out, see? You're one of a crew." It looked like a stripe of dried pork. Soft hair stiffened into bristles with ice. His gag reflex had long since been removed, and the meat slid down smooth until it started to melt, and warm copper flooded the back of his throat. "Get it down, lad," Hob said kindly. "You'll feel better for it." His eyes were warm red light like the fires of home. Sparks swallowed hard, and the lump passed down to his gullet. He did feel better as his body got to work making fuel of the meat. The aching in his limbs abated, and his sight came back a little way. "We're gentlemen here," Hob said. "Ain't we all?" All through the downhill side of night, Hob came again with his knife. Sparks cringed away, but the glint of the blade made his mouth fill with spit. Hob had been right about his soft parts. Everything that kept him alive the company had made. His lungs were two plastic sacs which continued to suck in hydrocarbons. His blood, piped through tubes, kept as warm as weak tea by his heated heart. When the day came again, he lay exposed. The dull metal of his reinforced bones caught the light. He set his own teeth on edge. Copper seized up with the sunrise. His eyes shifted from left to right, and he twitched his fingers as though dreaming of making a fist. Beyond that, he could not move. Hob took his harpoon and propped it up out of his reach. "Fair's fair," he said, and helped himself to a slice. Sparks could not raise himself from the floor of the boat, so Hob tossed him scraps. However much he ate, the hollow in his belly didn't ease. Copper's blood tasted like milk on the turn. Only Hob grew fat on their bounty, reclining in the stern intact. He watched the waves with red eyes. A great bubble rose from the depths and burst at the surface with a hollow glop. A shadow grew in the sea, and the little boat lifted on its swell. A honeycombed eye emerged, growing from a dark mass many times their length and broad enough to build a house on. Sparks unhinged his jaw. Copper creaked in his seat, and Hob jittered. They had all seen the Kraken before, hunted from the high decks of the Night Marie, or dead and diminished, being drained of its oil. But to see it, eye to eye, was to see it again for the first time. Their boat was like a popped cork, bobbing in the Kraken's bathtub. The Kraken turned and showed its 7 eyes, which were in a loop like a string of pearls. It uncurled its many arms, and they sprang like spilled ink across the face of the sea. It rolled at the surface, island huge, and then was gone, displacing methane down to the depths. The waves slopped in its wake and stilled. "Oh, that oil," Hob mourned. but his words rang as flat as an empty bell. The Kraken's eye had made aliens of them. Sparks felt bereft, and sank with it in thought down into the dark where the night Marie slept. He drifted for hours in a world without pain, a comrade among his dead crewmates. The Kraken loomed on the edge of his senses, the reach of its arms as wide as the moon. Sparks came back to himself as the sun went down. Coldness came inside him like a hooked claw, and every surface he touched seemed sharp. Copper sat slumped in his seat, reduced to a rough artist's sketch of a man. Hob sat humming in the bows. "I do my part," he sighed, "same as any man." He peeled a strip off himself. A scream cut the sky. For a moment, Sparks thought the Night Marie was sinking all over again, half men crying for mercy as they clung to her prow. He looked up and saw 2 stars falling towards him. "I told you they'd come," Hob crooned between the bars of his tuneless song. The scream became the anger of engines, and the black shape of a ship fell like a stone towards them, gusting hot air which turned the crests of the waves into gas. It pulled to a stop and hovered bare meters above their heads. New Moon Kraken Oil written on its hull. Its hatch fell open like an unhinged jaw. "What a mess!" someone said. A thin soup of frozen blood lay across the planks of the boat. The remains of the 3 half-men lay twisted like trees stripped by winter. The company needed a pitchfork to scoop them aboard. Scrap metal lived in the belly of the company ship. Sparks lay strewn about and shuddered by engines. He felt like a star in the dark.
Here's what Robin had to say about the piece. Moby Dick is one of my favourite novels, and this story is inspired by the same incident which inspired Herman Melville, the fate of the whaling ship Essex, which was sunk by a sperm whale, leaving the surviving crew drifting at sea for 95 days. My first reaction when I heard this was simple. Where's the line? What's the point beyond which you do not cross, and where does that line fall in comparison with the line society draws? That line is present in this boat with these half-men, but it's present in very different places for all of them, and I don't think any of them know why. Think about it. There is the almost perverse moment of honour at the heart of this piece. In the end, the half-men are always going to consume one another, not just because they need to survive, but for 2 other, larger, equally horrifying reasons. The first is that their ship going down, weirdly, frees them. The ocean becomes a terminus point, not quite dead, not quite alive, that they float on. They have no ship, they have no prerogative other than survival. They do this not just because they have to, but because they can. They choose to live. Horrific as life, in this instance, is. But do they? They're half-men in the employ of a company that doesn't care about anything other than the bottom line. Do they survive because they want to, or do they survive because the company has programmed them to try? They certainly don't seem to be surprised by their predicament or particularly worried. Is death a release? Is death something they signed a form about? Attended a seminar concerning? That's up to us. And what's up to them is deciding where that line is and sticking to it, because sometimes when you're adrift, the only thing you can cling to is the line that you won't cross, and the line you will. This is chilling and weird and will stick in my mind for some time. Thank you both. And if you like this, I recommend The Death and Life of Schneider Rack by Nate Crowley, and also everything else Nate has written. He is just truly extraordinary. We rely on you to pay our authors and cover our server costs, and everything else, basically. And recently you pushed us through our penultimate Patreon goal, which was to enable us to pay the SFWA pro rates without taking a financial hit. So you'll see us start to buy more original stories again, that kind of thing. Our last one is much simpler and much, in a sense, easier to achieve. We want to pay our associate editors, who are our slush wranglers, who every author who submits to us talks to. These are the folks who read every story, who select the ones which fit us, who fight for stories they love, and who end up in dialogue with authors about stories when they don't. They are, without a shadow of a doubt, the unsung heroes of the organisation, and on a wider level, slush readers are the unsung heroes of the industry. They're also some of the very last people in my company who we can't afford to pay. I'm a freelance journalist by day, and crime fighter by night, but we don't go into that. And it rankles me that people give up their time for no remuneration. That seems wrong, especially in the creative industry. So I would really, really love it if you could see your way clear to donating to us to help us get to the point where we could pay slush editors, associate editors, slush wranglers. They go by many names. Heroes are another. There are two ways you can do this. The first is to go to pseudopod.org, click on Feed the Pod, and make a donation or a subscription that way. It'll gain you access to our archive of extra audio and general goodies. The other way you can do this is via Patreon, where there are multiple levels, but again, it's a subscription model, and again, you gain access to the audio vault at pretty much the lowest level. However you can do it, even if all you can do, and we know money is tight at the moment, believe me, is just signal boost an episode you like or leave a review somewhere. Trust me, it all helps, and trust me, it's all needed. So if you can chip in, whether it's time or money, please do, and thank you. We'll be back next week when, as now, we will be a production of Escape Artists Incorporated and released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. And I leave you with this quote from the Wild Wild Sea, from the Sting album of the same name. When the bridge to heaven is broken, and you're lost on the wild, wild sea. See you next week, folks.
It's a pseudopod. It's a big foot.
It's all about podcasts these days.